We deal in illusions, man. None of it is true.
Hey, what's up, fellow slaves? So, based on the mainstream media's increasingly extreme rhetoric regarding climate change,
a global extinction event called the Great Dying occurred about 250 million years ago, and understanding what happened then could provide some insight into the impacts of climate change.
Going extinct is a bad thing.
And it's not safe to assume any species is safe from climate change. Basically, the fate of all wildlife is in our hands now.
Understanding the connection between climate and all life on the planet is an important first step. Without drastic measures to stop the Earth's warming,
I can pretty much tell that the climate fraud will be the next excuse these evil bastards use in order to push their tyrannical laws and mandates down our throats. So I'm making this video to shine light on exactly how they're coming up with their data and to prove that their data is indeed fraudulent. In order to prove this fraud, I'm going to start by looking at this article from Skeptical Science titled, "Are Surface Temperatures Reliable?" And so you all know, Skeptical Science is a pro-anthropogenic global warming website. So this website believes and perpetuates and subscribes to the mainstream narrative surrounding anthropogenic global warming. And under the basic answer for this article, it says, the warming trend is the same in rural and urban areas, measured by thermometers and satellite, and by natural thermometers. However, that isn't necessarily the point being argued. It's not necessarily the point, or at least it's not the main point, being made by these people who are indeed skeptical about anthropogenic climate change over at this website, surfacestations.org. The point that is actually being made, as you can see here under what the author of this article has erroneously labeled climate myth, is temperature record is unreliable. Quote, we found U.S. weather stations located next to the exhaust fans of air conditioning units, surrounded by asphalt parking lots and roads, on blistering hot rooftops, and near sidewalks and buildings that absorb and radiate heat. We found 68 stations located at wastewater treatment plants where the process of waste digestion causes temperatures to be higher than in surrounding areas. In fact, we found that 89% of the stations, nearly 9 of every 10, fail to meet the National Weather Service's own siting requirements that stations must be 30 meters, about 100 feet, or more away from an artificial heating or radiating reflecting heat source. And then it gives the source for this quote, which is Watts 2009. And this Watts 2009, it is the paper, or well, Watts is the author of this paper, and this author has this website, surfacestations.org. And I'm going to be looking at surfacestation.org and not necessarily this paper that this guy published. And if you read this article at Skeptical Science that I'm covering here, you'll find that the article doesn't prove this point to be a myth at all. The research papers this article cites actually agree with this claim that nearly 9 out of 10 of these stations used for collecting data do not meet standards. The research paper says, notably, only 71 US HCN stations fall into the good exposure category, while 454 fall into the poor category. So they used a total of 525 stations in this research article, or at least in this research paper that the Skeptical Science had cited. They used 525 stations, and only 71 of them fall into the good category. So only 13% of the stations this research paper took data from were good. Or to put it another way, 87% of the stations it took data from fail to meet standards, which is almost exactly what the people who are skeptical about anthropogenic climate change said. So how exactly does this research paper and the other research paper used in the article, which does the exact same thing, how do these research papers, how do these scientists prove that the surface temperature record is reliable? I'm going to actually begin at sophiststations.org, which is the website of the guy who authored the paper the Skeptical Science article was trying to debunk. And I'm starting here because it'll make it a lot easier for us to understand the papers that perpetuate the climate fraud. And more importantly, I want to start here because I want to show what he did. I want to show that this guy is talking about these apples over here and compare that to what these scientists did so that you can see that those guys are talking about oranges. This guy here is talking about apples. Those guys there, they're talking about oranges. As you can see, it appears like the website hasn't been updated since 2012, which sucks because the links to the pictures are all pretty much dead. For now, the important thing is this pie chart that shows us the percent of stations that had a CRN rating of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And CRN stands for Climate Reference Network. So this is the mainstream climate reference network and their own station ratings. And as you can see, 64.4% of the climate stations audited at this time, it's not like all of them were audited, but a lot of them were. I think it's like 89% throughout the country. So 64.4% of the climate stations audited at this time had a CRN rating of 4, which means they can be showing temperatures that are 2 or more degrees Celsius warmer than it actually is. 6.2% had a CRN rating of 5, which has the potential to make the thermometers over 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it really is. 21.5% had a CRN rating of 3, which has the potential to make it read temperatures 1 degree Celsius warmer than it really is. Only 6.7% had a rating of 2, and even worse, only 1.2% had a rating of 1, which is like the perfect, it's like the gold standard, the rating of 1. So surfacestations.org also has data on the types of equipment used, and as you can see, most of the equipment being used is this MMTS equipment that we will learn more about later from the climate fraud paper. The most important thing on surfacestations.org are these two pictures with these two graphs. Unfortunately, the NASA links for the two graphs are now dead, so I had to use these rather poor quality photos to prove my next couple of points. Actually, to prove almost all of the rest of my points. I'm really sorry. For those who can't see, the top picture and graph is from a station in Orland, California, and the bottom one is from Marysville, California. I think that's how you say it. And as you can see from these Google Earth pictures, these stations are within a few miles of each other, but they have very different temperature graphs. And as we can see, they're also in very different sorts of locations. One is by a parking lot, and one looks to be in like a field. So the thermometer in Marysville is located in what is labeled here as the MMTS shelter. MMTS is an electronic thermometer, and you can see it is right next to a black road or a blacktop, which is something that absorbs and radiates heat. Its location is also right next to where cars park. Cars are a source of heat. It's also right next to air conditioning exhaust fans, which also produce heat. However, it is also close enough to the building that depending on where the sun is in the sky, the building might actually be able to provide shade, as can the large cell phone tower right next to it. You see there's this large cell phone tower. Now let's look at what the station in Orland looks like. And as you can see, it is an open field where nothing can produce artificial heat and where nothing can produce artificial shade either. Now let's compare the two graphs. It should be noted that the graph from Orland has a higher maximum temperature than the graph from Marysville. So these two graphs are not exactly one-to-one graphs. The graph from Orland goes to 21 degrees Celsius, and the graph from Marysville only goes up to 19 degrees Celsius. And this is because the graph from Orland has data from before 1900, when it appears to have been much warmer than it has been at any point in the last 100 years. Now that is, of course, very important. I also noticed that there are some major differences in temperatures between the two charts between the years 1905 and 1935. As you can see, in 1905, both Orland's and Marysville's average noon temperature was recorded at about 15.5 degrees Celsius. And the following years, they both go up to about 16.5 degrees Celsius and 17 degrees Celsius. But then Marysville temperature drops to 14.5 degrees Celsius, while Orland's stays well above 16.5 degrees Celsius. So I have to ask, what the hell caused this difference of 2 degrees Celsius, and why did it last from roughly 1910 to roughly 1925? I don't fucking know. Honestly, guys, I don't know this. This is just a question that I'm throwing out there. I don't have the answer to that question. It's just something that I thought should be pointed out and taken note of. Even during the 1930s and 40s, Orland shows as being an average of a whole degree warmer than Marysville. But then around 1950, their temperatures come closer to being the same, with Orland reaching an all-time low of about 15.25 degrees Celsius, and Marysville reaching about 15.5 degrees Celsius. At this point, since we've looked at the two graphs enough and we can differentiate between the two, I've decided to overlay them to show how the two remain about the same until the 1980s. I've taken 3 screenshots with varying opacities of the different overlays, so you can see exactly what I am talking about. It should be noted that these are not perfect overlays, and I compensated upwards to avoid any accusations that my bias caused me to compensate downwards. So we see that the unadjusted data of 2 locations that are relatively close to each other shows that the station that doesn't meet the standards has had a higher average temperature since the early 1980s. And the most recent data shows that the station that doesn't meet standards is a whole degree of Celsius warmer than the station that meets standards. If it's hard for you to make out, here, the one that doesn't meet standards is reading an average of about 18 to almost 18.5 degrees Celsius, and the one that meets standards is struggling to reach 17 degrees Celsius. So this appears to be demonstrable proof that these surface temperature stations are out of sync and are thus unreliable. And the guy who authored this, the guy who did all of this research, he provided a lot more evidence than just these 2 stations. So what did the fraudsters do to cover up this very obvious fact? How did the fraudsters prove that the surface temperature record is reliable? Now let's take a closer look at the research paper to see exactly how they are cheating the American citizens and the people all around the world. So the paper is titled, "On the Reliability of the U.S. Surface Temperature Record." And we only really need to look at the introduction of the paper and the methods used. So the introduction of this paper gives us some more information on what the creator of sophiststations.org was arguing in his own research paper. Watts, 2009, in particular, has speculated that U.S. surface temperature records from the USHCN from the last 30 years or so are likely biased high warm, thereby artificially enhancing the magnitude of observed temperature trends. This conclusion is based on recent photographic documentation of stations in the USHCN indicating that the widespread installation of the Electronic Maximum Minimum Temperature System, MMTS, and Nimbus-type thermistors, which began in the mid-1980s, often caused measurements to be taken much closer to heated buildings, paved surfaces, and other artificial sources of heat than was likely the case for the thermometers that they replaced. Liquid and glass, LIG thermometers, were generally housed in wooden cotton region shelters, also known as Stevenson screens, that were more easily located further from the buildings where the observers worked or resided. In contrast, the MMTS replacements are attached by cable to an indoor readout device. Limits on the maximum allowable length of cable, as well as barriers along the cable pathway, example given sidewalks, parking lots, apparently led to the placements of these sensors closer to buildings and other objects that may negatively influence exposure than their CRS predecessors. So in the introduction of this paper, they let us know that yes, in the 1980s, they introduced these new temperature readers that caused these temperature readers to have to be closer to buildings and to other heated sources. So this is why the data in Orland, California and Marysville, California seem to go in different directions in the 1980s, with Marysville getting supposedly hotter and Orland appearing to not get nearly as hot at all. The paper goes on to say that, these instrument changes and these sensor moves are known to cause shifts in the mean level of station temperature series, and that they are unrelated to true variations in the climate signal. And then the article mentions how they account for these non-climatic artifacts in a process called homogenization. And then they also go into homogenization, and then they have to remove their assumptions, which is like a debiasing of the numbers. Basically, they put those numbers from these stations through this whole process. And basically, we have to trust that they didn't adjust this data to favor their narrative. And I want to just quickly look at the charts. I want to look at their data, their adjusted maximums next to their unadjusted maximums, and of course their minimums too. So they present this chart. This is figure 2. And all we have to do is look at the top two on the left, the adjusted maximum and the unadjusted maximum for those temperature sets. So when we look at this, you notice in the unadjusted maximum, the stations with the poor siting, that is the stations that are next to artificial heat sources and next to things that radiate heat, they're showing that they have a lower temperature anomaly. And this is them, if you read their paper and if you read even the other article from Skeptical Science, they actually try to argue that these stations show or report cooler temperatures. Now, that's not what's happening. And you know what? I'm just going to spoil the surprise. Basically, what's happening here, if you look at the charts, they're not looking at the actual temperature here. These graphs here that are going up and down that they're showing here, this isn't necessarily looking at the temperature, it's looking at the temperature anomalies. See, if we go back to the other article, the Skeptical Science article, See, if we go back to the Skeptical Science article, it specifically mentioned the warming trend is the same in rural and urban areas. So here, instead of looking at the actual temperature, they're looking at temperature trends and temperature anomalies. And basically, it's possible that the stations with the poor sighting are showing a lower temperature trend upwards, or a lower warming trend, or a slower warming trend than the stations with the good sighting, because those stations with the poor sighting already had this artificial heat source, so they were already pretty high. So now, if it's getting a little bit warmer, they don't appear to be getting that much warmer than they already were. Then if you skip ahead in the introduction says that the researchers did the following. In brief, we use recent information about sighting characteristics to derive maximum and minimum temperature trends from stations that have good instrument exposures and compare them to trends based on records from stations with poor exposure. That sounds perfectly fine, right? No, because once again, they are talking about maximum and minimum temperature trends, not temperature readings. And now one of the most important things about this research paper is the date that they start their data collection at. If you look at these charts, they're starting it in 1980. This is exactly like what they just did with the wildfire data, where they erased all of the wildfire data, or at least declared it unofficial data, before 1983. So everything before 1983 with the wildfires is unofficial data, and here they only use data from 1980. Why? Because 1980 was a low point in both areas. 1980 is a low point for the graph, like if we go back to the Orland and Marysville graph, 1980 is actually a low point, or at least a relatively low point, on both graphs. So here, if you look at Orland, 1980, I have the arrow, it's about 1980. We have this kind of somewhat medium high point here, but then it goes really low over here in 1980. And you have a similar thing in the Marysville graph. Marysville, you kind of have like this somewhat middle high point here, but then you have this steep drop, and then right around there, that 1980s part, if you start both graphs from there, they both have temperature trends that are going upwards. So yes, if you start from 1980, both of these graphs actually do have similar temperature trends, or both of these stations, the station that has the poor setting and the station that has the good setting, they both show the same trend actually. So regardless, even when they have the unadjusted temperature here, even if they don't have any data manipulation here, because they started in 1980, and because they're focusing only on the temperature trend and the temperature anomalies, they're basically the same thing, the unadjusted raw data is going to show very similar, if not almost exactly the same, temperature trend going from low to high. And we can see that, look, what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to cut off the entire charts up until 1980. I'm going to erase all of the data, and now you'll see that the temperature trend, although they have a different ending point, like by 1 degree, like there's that 1 degree difference, because once again, Orland, it ends, at least this data collection here, like I guess that's like 2008 or something like that. I don't know exactly when this graph ends here. It's hard to determine. It looks like maybe 2008, 2009, 2010, around then. Orland ends around 17 degrees Celsius, and Marysville ends around 18 degrees Celsius. But you'll see they have a very similar trend from low to high. These trends are very similar, so what they do is they're both actually showing the same trend. And that's exactly what they did. Instead of showing the raw numbers, instead of showing the exact temperatures, they instead show the temperature trend and the temperature anomaly. And that's exactly why these cocksuckers over at Skeptical Science, in their basic answer, they use that specific language where they say the warming trend is the same in rural and urban areas, measured by thermometers and satellites and by natural thermometers. See, yeah, their trend is the same, but the question still remains. Is the surface temperature reliable? They showed us that the trend is the same, but is the temperature reliable? For example, going back to Orland, California and Marysville, California, which one has the reliable surface temperature? As we've seen, Orland, California in 2008 is reading at around 17 degrees Celsius. This is their average noontime temperature, is 17 degrees Celsius. Marysville is at 18 degrees Celsius to almost 18.5 degrees Celsius. The year before, the final point on these charts was 18.5 degrees Celsius. So which one is the reliable temperature? And not only that, not only which one is reliable, but Orland had an average temperature reading in 1890 of over 20 degrees Celsius. So taking that into context, taking that into perspective, taking that into consideration, is this warming that we're seeing, this small warming trend to 17 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Celsius, is it actually a threat? It doesn't appear like it. We've had warmer temperatures before, and we have better technology for dealing with the heat now. So is this really a threat? I mean, if it was 20 degrees Celsius, I mean, how come everything didn't go extinct then? I mean, according to them, if our temperature goes up a couple more degrees Celsius, we're all fucking doomed, right? So how come the world didn't end in 1890? How come everything didn't go extinct when Orland, California had an average noontime temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, which is anywhere between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius higher than it was reading in 2008. So it's super fucked. Did you guys catch all of that, or am I fucking crazy? I mean, I can admit maybe I'm fucking crazy, and maybe I'm the one who just erroneously interpreted all of that, but I don't think that I am. But who knows? Maybe I'm just super fucking crazy, and these people really just love us and care for us and just want the best for us, right? I can't even say that with a straight face. These people, I mean, they kill people all around the world. These are some of the most evil motherfuckers in the world, in history. I mean, in human history, these people are fucking sick. And I'd much rather come off as crazy for not believing them and, giving my reasons for not believing them like I did in this video, than being fucking dumb enough to just believe them.
This is mass madness, you maniacs! In God's name, you people are the real thing! We are the illusion!